passed by the Senate and came over to us. And there were a couple of things that came up when we had testimony from the agency last week that were sort of flags that we might want to, maybe we can have reach some decisions on today. I don't think we have to. We've also invited NOFA to come in later in the week and share their thoughts to the bill as it currently stands. And we've also invited the logging community to come in because there's the conversation about merging the two bills together. So what I wanted to do was go through the bill. Just I'll flag the things. If we had Ledge Council here, we could have it up on the screen and we could be doing it that way. But since we don't, we printed it out. And see whether people have any thoughts. That sounds like a good plan. I'm going to skip over the findings because, and we'll come back to the findings at some point. And I haven't looked them over carefully myself, but Ledge Council pointed out that findings are best if you can cite a source. So skip over them for now, but I think some of them might be appropriate because there's a source. Some of them might want to think about tweaking or see whether we can find a source for them. So that's the first page is basically findings.
Where do you reference the source in the actual findings or footnotes?
No, I think it's just something you have at your fingertips. So if somebody were to ask the floor, I've heard that happen. People want to know, where did that come from?
Right. So if you're like 4 out of 10 Vermonters has food insecurity.
Yeah.
We say as the United Nations acknowledged 4 out of 10 Vermonters.
For example, and I said I wouldn't, but the second finding here is many programs designed to support farms are difficult to access or administratively burdensome. That may be true. It may not be true. It's a little more, perhaps, something could be thought of as somebody's perspective rather than something grounded in data.
The less editorial, the better.
Yeah. But on the other hand, there are not very many findings here, and we've certainly seen bills that have pages and pages of findings. So we can come back to that. So on page 2, then we get into the definitions and a list of the kinds of weather conditions that we're going to see later would qualify for, potentially qualify for funding. And this list might be complete, but if there's anything that comes up that we think should be added to the list, I suppose if there's anything on the list that doesn't seem to fit, we could make a note of that too.
About
Representative O'Brien.
the one thing about like weather conditions that I just want to that it could be defined as such as, so many of them are like a flood or a frost or a high winds, ice event. They're like a 1, 2, 3 day event. Whereas things like drought, can take 4 months to really manifest itself in devastating ways. So how are sort of longer duration severe weather events calculated by the agency? At what point in a drought is it like, 3 months it's a drought, or if it goes another month, is it a double drought? It's just the thought, because certainly your weather and sort of Jed's logging.
Yeah.
Rather than, if it's 200 days, if you can't get into the woods kind of thing.
Yeah. So you might have
Just the way maybe to.
Yeah.
Split them out and say like, the really intense ones that we all can recognize.
Well, that's the whole crux of it. When you start looking at these and, you know, we're all familiar, Vermont has microclimates. And we cover a large geographical area farming. And we may have a particular area. I've had particular areas experience drought. And you go over the next hill and around the next corner and it's fine, and before that it's fine. And it's not the soil type, it's, the microclimate, just, it didn't rain there. Same with downburst, microburst, we've all, and those can be really, really, really destructive. To crops. Well,
It's super localized too.
had a roof peeled right off over my head, standing there. You hit the barn. Sean. See you later. Luckily my pickup was parked further down the barn and it didn't land on it. So. And the part of this that it had to be a declared disaster. And I don't know if we want to pin it to a nationally declared disaster or something that the governor declares a disaster or the Secretary of Agriculture declares, somebody's got to declare. Because I don't think.
I think actually we'll get to that.
Okay, that's ahead, yeah.
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 And maybe we don't need to linger on this list here, but we might want to come back to it when we get to that other section. Right now, so when we see the words eligible weather condition, it refers to this list.
Yeah.
And at some point we'll want to decide, is that the actual list that we want to include or not? And then there is at the bottom, any other, so it, sort of gives an out, any other severe weather or growing conditions impacting agricultural income as determined by the review board. So there's some flexibility there.
Is this definition of farm, Dave? Does that appear in a lot of various parts of statute?
I don't know whether this is picked up from another place in statute or if it's yet another
Right, I know, that's
27.
I've never seen it quite defined this way, but I
Yeah.
guess we could ask Mike O'Grady.
Yep. All right. So that's a good question.
So it's subject to RAPs.
Yeah. Devoted primarily to farming and is subject to regulation under the RAPs. Yeah, so this came up the other day, I think, when the agency was here. Do we want to limit this to farms that are subject to the RAPs?
Well, that's my question, and I don't know. So school me, are vegetable farmers subject to RAPs? I mean, I'm sure they can't throw their squash right over the bank of the river, but are they subject to RAPs such as dairy farmers are? Because if they're not, then this blocks them out and that needs to be, the RAP part needs to be stricken.
Yeah.
Question,
Uh,
Heather,
question for Heather?
a farm your size, are you subject to RAPs?
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
Because of its collectiveness or your
because
particular?
the size of our dairy farm, we are a certified small farm. So we are subject to RAPs.
And how about the portion? Do you work on all or just your plot?
For veggies.
For veggies, I work on the dairy farm. Yes. Work on the dairy farm. So I am subject to our own regulations as it comes to the spreading of compost, manure, waste, the closeness it can be to my vegetable plot, and then additionally, we're certified organic, so we have our own levels of certification we have to go through. But the farm itself is under the RAPs.
But what about someone like the Intervale farmers? You know, what was the group something Murph that came and spoke to us? Are they subject to RAPs? Or are they just subject to acceptable ag practices or do they do their, I know NOFA has rules, or the National Omri has rules. You know, the National Organic Standards, but are they set in statute like the RAPs are?
Yeah, because RAPs are predominantly water related and waste management.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what the intervale is. Yeah.
Maddie?
And there's a monetary, you have to make $2,000, right?
Yeah,
So somebody who's, yeah.
Right. Patio tomato. you're probably-
Mandy, do you want to just, you don't need to come up to the table if you feel you can contribute to this. Yeah.
I'm happy to. Maddie Kempner, NOFA, for the record. Vegetable farmers are subject to the RAPs.
They are.
Yeah, it covers a very wide range. And there's thresholds where they have to produce an annual gross income from the sale of agricultural products of $2,000 or more on average per year. And there's a threshold for tilled acres. So it has to be equal to or more than 4 contiguous acres. And then there's thresholds for different livestock numbers. So it's very broadly applicable.
Yeah, but so they have RAP. So if RAP stayed in this bill, it would cover the diversity of agriculture we're looking to cover.
Yes, and the definition of farm is also pulled from the RAP's rule, which is what you were asking about.
Thank you.
Like, you know, sugaring, orchards, I assume, different tree farms, all these things, RAPs.
Probably sugar is. But for our, not our APs,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Orchard would be covered.
yes. I mean, I think because we have tilled ground pumpkins too, so I'm just.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And also cow.
Yes, my dad.
we can check, we can double check with O'Grady and just be sure that we're not leaving somebody out who we think, who we imagine would be, who we would want to
So I
qualify.
want to check on the sugar paper part.
Okay, let's see, then there's a definition of the board, which we have to do later, and then a definition of farming, which is a reference to existing statute. Okay. And then 4632, there is established the special fund to be administered by secretary. And the fund consists of funds that the General Assembly appropriates, so through our budgeting process. Funds from public and private sources. Funds from the federal government, potentially. I guess those three. And I don't think we've had anybody question that or suggest that that's not the right list. And then the secretary shall ensure language, accessibility through procurement provision of interpretation and translation services. And then on page 4, all balances at the end of any fiscal year, June 30th, shall be carried forward and remain part of the fund. So if which I think is consistent with what we all imagine the fund would do.
Until they claw it back and use it somewhere else.
Well, yeah, yeah.
So the fund could grow.
Yes, yeah.
Would there be flexibility in here if we identified a dedicated funding source? For example, like Michelle's, you know, a tax on sugar or something like that. Would that be done in rules or would we have to tweak language?
I think that we would want to spell that out here in, one, as another one on the list, or take number one and change it.
Okay.
More specific, yeah. But let me make it for that. Okay. Now we're getting to the point, I think, where, well, let's keep going here. So 4633, the secretary, after consultation with the board, shall award grants to farms that have incurred financial losses or expenses due to an eligible weather condition. So now that's referring back to that list. Grants shall be in an amount that reimburses a farm up to 50% losses. And it's uninsured or otherwise uncovered losses due to eligible weather conditions, up to a maximum of 150,000 per year per farm. Richard.
Back up on A, eligible weather conditions. And if you go back over to definitions, eligible weather, and it says widespread fire event like a wildfire. Rare, but could happen, especially to a sugar bush or, well, it could happen to anywhere. Do we want to add in eligible weather condition and or, wildfire?
It does say fire.
I don't know if you just leave it under the eligible weather condition. That it says widespread fire, which could be.
So you're thinking like a wildfire is something different from a what?
Well, it's a widespread fire event, but it's not necessarily a weather event.
Okay.
You could, you don't need to be in a drought to have, it helps to be droughty, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a class 4 drought to have a wildfire. I'm not talking a barn fire or stuff. I'm talking,
So we would want, sounds like you're saying that in any case, we would want that to be a covered event that would qualify.
or ask O'Grady to clarify, because say a wildfire event happened to Greg's maple sugar and got it, into part of his apple trees and you lost all your tubing. Maybe you didn't lose your trees or your crop might be affected for the next year. That's a realistic scenario, I think.
Yeah. So
I can think back to it's an extreme wind event. It's a sugar operator on Plot Road outside of Waterville going back toward Johnson. Who his sugar bush got destroyed. He had a lot of it's going through, but it flattens. About 70%.
Ice storm in 98.
That was previous. This was a wind event.
Yeah.
You probably
But you're
reached
speaking
out
to really hyper localized.
to the microburst.
Yeah.
We had some of it's 50.
yeah, I mean, I guess maybe we want to think about widespread, whether that's qualifier we want in there. If it's a fire event that isn't widespread, but is not the result of somebody kicking over a lantern when they're going out to milk cows. Is that the way it still works? So,
And I was thinking even like lightning hits like the dairy barn and burns
Yeah.
it down.
Great.
Or lightning fells a tree and cows, that's like, will we further define it so that it's not that specific maybe?
okay, so Showing the maximum award of 150,000 there was in the original language, I think, and that was also, we don't see it in the Senate version, but the original funding amount that was envisioned was 20 million. We may want to think about whether that 150 is the right amount in a world where the funding might be something less than 20 million.
Could we tie a percentage to that? You know, if you took 150,000 and the first. You know, 150,000 is a percentage of 20 million. But if it's only funded at 7.5 million, then it would be something like 50 million, $50,000 per event, or, you know. Tie it to a percentage or whatever money is in the fund.
Yep.
You know, and the fund, if the fund should happen to grow and not ever get rated. You know, it could be more, but 150,000 is a lot of money.
Is there any awareness of, you know, of the crop, say, that was lost, whether there's a way, like we were listening on Friday, to you know, pivot, and if you're a, you know, market gardener and plant, you still, you know, maybe July floods, you still get sort of half a season, you can grow lots of greens in that time. So it wasn't as cataclysmic as, say, the potato farmer on the Connecticut who lost, you know, a whole summer's crop just done. So is there any recognition of that sort of level of this is, you know, a whole summer's worth, or this is, you know, maybe a 2-month loss out of 6 or 8 months of the growing season?
Yeah. Well, the next sentence, part 2, might give us a way to think about that. So this is the ability of the secretary to set criteria for the amount of award that factors in the annual net income of the farm and compares it to the median net income of all farms in Vermont. So it's taking some sort of a baseline statewide. Here's what the average farm makes. This farm suffered a loss. Here's what its income typically might be, and then adjusting the award. It doesn't say up or down based on, you know, where it falls in relation to other farms. So we could also think about expanding that to include, or maybe having a separate criterion, I guess, John, that thinks about what could the farmer do then to replace that crop, or what would the farmer be doing anyway to replace that crop? Is that what the situation you're envisioning?
Well, I mean, the veggie farmers on Friday were saying, like, as part of their sort of flood resilience planning now is they're planning those sort of season-long crops on higher grounds where there's less chance of flooding.
Mhm.
Doing more short turnaround veggies
Yeah,
in the floodplains.
yeah.
For that very reason.
So would some kind of net income, you know, annual income criterion account for that, or does it seem like we would want to expand it and think more?
It'd be interesting to work through that, whatever that formula would be, given that we just heard that 50 to 75% of farms lose money.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, just what I was gonna say. You know, define net income,
Yeah, no kidding.
you know.
You're right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, making a note of that.
But if you give the secretary enough flexibility to come up with a metric or something, then they could, even in the application, it might say, you know, part of the application might be, could you recover to plant further crops and have veggie revenue, you know, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Okay, keep going here. So I'm on line 14. Secretary may verify the occurrence of the weather condition through a site visit or through use of data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Yeah, they got gutted.
And this is all, I'll go back to line 14, the secretary may verify. That word may is small but important. I think Brian Chena incorporated that importance in his bill presentation this morning. It doesn't say shall, it says may. So it's optional. If we wanted it to say shall, to require the secretary to do that, then we could include that. But this gives the secretary some leeway.
Yeah.
Presumably, if it's national news, you don't need to do a site visit
Yeah,
or consult NOAA.
yeah, if you're on CBS, evening news, you're in trouble. But should it say secretary and or designee? You know,
Yeah, and that might be implied. But I'll put that in there. Yeah, it might be the case that generally it's understood that if you say secretary, that means anybody within the secretary might appoint. Okay, keep going.
Is it okay if I suggest?
Okay, bring them in if you like. Okay, moving on to number 4, losses that are reimbursable by a grant under the section include lost wages.
Do we want to, I think this is the first time grants popped up. Do we want to just talk about grant or beneficiary?
Yes.
And talk to Council Grady about if we should change that all the way through?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to line 5. Thank you, Richard. Shall award grants.
Go to the beneficial
Yeah,
payment.
Beneficial payment, yeah.
yeah.
Nicole saying that actually BGAP was a grant.
It turned out that the BGAT program is a grant program, yeah. That requires ongoing reporting of how it's worked out. Okay, so what is coverable here? Wages or compensation, lost wages or compensation. Replacement of lost income from destroyed crops or impacted livestock. Loss of debt payments or other ongoing expenses. Costs of replanting.
Oh, interesting.
Feed replacement costs, infrastructure, equipment repair and replacement, roads, so repair of roads, and other losses. So this is the catch-all, other losses as determined after consultation with the board.
Okay, so you're talking about replacing wages, then lost income. I don't know if you need debt payments or other ongoing expenses if you're covering lost income.
Right, you're not trying to show whether or not you can repay the.
Yeah.
The-
Yeah. There's, it's only
Oh,
gonna
wow.
cover up to 50% of the losses, so it's not necessarily gonna cover all your debt payments, but it's gonna, you're replacing income. So if you're replacing income, you're replacing debt. I'm just thinking it's redundant and I don't know if it needs to be in there.
I had the same thought about wages and wages of compensation. I'm not quite sure I'm seeing whether this is a list of things that are all in the same category.
Yeah, because wages, compensation, that's all part of the income deal. You know,
Yeah.
you pay your wages to your employees from your income. And I just think that shortens up the burden of the person applying for the loss.
John?
So, Richard, how would that work if, say, like, it's July, you have your potato crop is destroyed, is there's some formula for what that potato crop would have brought in for income, you know, because in the meantime, it was only half grown, and I've got mortgage payments on, you know,
Yeah.
payments on my family.
Yeah, but so, you know, historic data, I guess, and I'm, you know, they can say they make 20,000 pounds of potatoes per acre.
So that'll be part of the secretary's
Yeah,
formula.
Yeah, but I don't know, I am, again, naive to broccoli or onions or whatnot, but maybe they go to other farmers in the area and say, you know, there's people out there that have that expertise, you know, that say, you know, a typical acre of broccoli brings in this much, you know, conventional broccoli's here, organic broccoli's here, or onions, you know, you go to Pete's Greens and you know, how much you make off of
But you're estimating sort of that crop coming to fruition.
to fruition all the way through. That's how crop insurance works on corn. They don't say, well, your corn is only half grown. It's only worth, you know,
Right.
no, you didn't get a crop. And it doesn't matter if you could replant or not. You didn't get that crop. So this is what that crop is worth. Now, if you're able to replant and you're only getting 50%. So if you have the onus to go, you know, go out there and try to recover your other 50%, and if that means going from broccoli or onions, onions I hear are pretty good payers. You know, going from onions to go to greens that you can plant and in 50 days start to get a harvest and get a couple harvests before Mother Frost says you're done. You know, you help to recruit more of your loss. You know, this isn't a make whole, you know, and
Right.
Any other thoughts on this list here? I circled on line 7 that it has or, so just going back to previous page, losses that are reimbursable, but under this section include, and it has a list, and the last one is or, that, so I'm not sure if that means you have to pick one or whether it could be the case where you have both the cost of replanting. Yeah,
Sort of an or.
maybe, yeah. If you had, let's say you have to replant, you have cost of replanting and you have feed replacement costs. You would presumably want both of those to be coverable.
Well, like our Maple Wind witness who said that, you know, they lost the tractor going out to save the turkeys and
Right.
they had crops that are also destroyed. So
Equipment.
diversified farms
Yeah,
could easily check off 3 or 4 of these.
Yeah. Okay. The secretary shall develop an application for awards under the section. So this is what the process would look like for somebody who's trying to qualify. A brief description of the damage, the testing of the weather event, an estimate of the losses, and then a year-round report of farm income and expenses from Schedule F.
And I didn't ask. Yeah, I don't know, we're an LLC if we file a Schedule F or. And somewhere didn't it say or an income, because, you know, was it last year's Schedule F or, you know, someone said an income statement, you know, profit loss statement. I think we.
Maybe the other bill had possibly a provision for a profit and loss statement, and maybe this bill originally did. Yeah. Also, the question came up, whether LLCs, right, file the Schedule F. I guess that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I'll ask my brother.
An application may be made at any time And the fund may only close the application process upon award of all appropriated funds for the relevant fiscal year. Um, One thing that occurs to me is that the way this is currently structured with the fiscal year going from July to June, that somebody who has a disaster in June, at the end of June, is the least likely to get funded. And somebody who has a disaster on July 1st would be the most likely to get funded. So that there may be no way around that, but there's just something to be.
Seasonal?
Well, I
Could we write in seasonal because farming typically runs from April to October, depending on where you are in the state. April to October is the growing season. And if you have a disaster in May, I'll have frost damage to your orchard and the fund's depleted, but January 1st, it's gonna be primed again. It should, to me, be seasonal. All right, so we had 100 acres of corn tagged by frost a few years ago. Luckily, we replanted just 10 acres, the rest of it didn't hit the grow point. We just went in and dusted up 10 acres, bigger deal. We had the seed on hand. But for someone like Champlain Orchards that may have lost their whole year's crop, to not have a chance at recouping part of their losses just because of the state runs from July 1st to June 30th. It should go under seasonal. So if there's no money in the fund in June, they can wait till it's funded in July and apply that. I just think that's, looking around the corner.
Yeah, and I was going to say, after you gave that example, that no matter how we structured it, there's going to be a beginning and an end.
It's linear, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unless we thought about it very differently, which is possible. I mean, we could say there are no awards until the end of the season, and then you look back and decide how you're going to parse it out. But that defeats the purpose of it.
Yeah, that doesn't make it speedy quick,
Right, yeah.
but, and in my realm, the corn crop is planted, it's done. The expenses are timed out over 12 months. If we get a check in September or November or December, we're gonna cover, use it to cover added feed expense then. Whereas if you are, I don't know how it works. Like in the orchard world, Greg, could you wait till late fall after the growing season to see if you're awarded or not? Does it make a difference? In the apple world?
If I had like a frost event in the spring, well, normally we wouldn't be getting paid for those apples until.
Yeah.
But if you do something like a CSA, or you say, I don't have the fruit,
Mhm.
and you get paid up front because it's a CSA. And you lose members that year because of it, then you'd be, but most orchards aren't
Mhm.
CSA, I don't think, but.
One of the
You do
things.
have that's a possibility.
Yeah, and, in the vegetable world, I know a lot of them
That happen a lot.
There's a big CSA in Wyndham County, Scott Orchard does that.
One option I'm thinking in my head is award half of what you would. This isn't as good for somebody who might have something like a CSA, but to make sure that if there are multiple disasters in the state in 1 year, to make sure at least everyone gets awarded something, is to give half the award out immediately and then wait until like December 1st to award
or November.
the other half, so that, and then January 1, if the fund is replenished or whatever, or once again. That way you have a full year where it's more likely that you're gonna have funding available.
I think that what we might do is put this back to the farmers who would be affected and ask them when we get testimony. We're gonna get more testimony, so, just if they have thoughts on this, because I don't know that there's an easy answer, but, if there were plenty of money in the fund, it would be less of an issue. If there's only a finite amount that is gonna be difficult to, not go through fairly quickly, then it is gonna be an issue. That's an interesting suggestion, I think, for
Or,
possibly dealing with it.
or you break it into quarterly. Where you say and you can prorate each quarter. Because you're more likely to have disasters in spring, summer and fall than you are in the winter. And each quarter you have a certain amount that you can dole out.
And if you don't use it in the spring.
Say it's a frost event that happens and impacts a lot of orchards, well, you have a certain amount to dole out by June 21st.
With a cap.
With a cap for that quarter, for spring,
And if you don't use it, you roll it.
and then you have another, right,
Yeah, okay,
is that
yeah.
another option?
The next section gets at the same question from, and this is where the bill is currently written, applications shall be processed in the order received. An application shall not be ready until the secretary determines the application is complete. But the key part of that is that in the order they are received, so it's getting back to the same issue. Okay, then all complete applications shall be evaluated by the review board and within some number of days, got 15 here. Following receipt of a complete application, the board by majority vote shall recommend whether to issue a grant to the applicant. If the board recommends an award, the secretary shall issue the award within 15 days. And I think we heard testimony from the agency suggesting that they could work with that timing, that anything less might be challenging on either end, I think. And either the original bill or the other bill had a shorter time frame, that a set 7-day time frame that was
7 days.
difficult, yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Pretty quick. If they're gonna do their, doing due diligence.
So we've seen several references to the board, and then the next section, 4634, creates the board, the review board. And we did hear from the agency last week that they had some questions about whether a board was the right way to handle this, as opposed to having the agency itself make the determination. And a couple of reasons were suggested for that. One was that if we had a board that you would need to warn the meetings, that would take some time, contributed maybe to the 15-day concern, that the meetings they'd be public meetings. If there was financial information that farmers were sharing, that you would need to have executive session and so forth, which can be done.
It also says in here that the board has been made up of members that have had a disaster. And then there's question whether if you're on the board and there's a disaster and it hits your farm, you have to step away from the board. And so maybe I think everything else is usually handled by the agency, and maybe it should be left like that. Because that would give them speed to operate. Whereas you have a board and your farm's been hit or not hit, and you're in the middle of cropping, you gotta break away and go to a meeting. to look at this stuff. Maybe it'd be better off if it's just handled by the agency.
There was a
Yeah.
definition of, the farmers who have received relief funding, is that from this specific severe weather event, or is it just over the last 5 years? I mean, we could broaden that. So
Yeah, so I think it says in here that to be on the board, you have had to have had incurred one in the past.
at some point.
Yeah. And then is it, one that received compensation or is it just one that got slapped silly,
Those here received relief funding.
Yeah.
Received relief
It
funding, yeah.
doesn't give any historical window.
Michelle?
I think that there were a couple different people who testified, and I don't remember exactly which ones they were, who were suggesting that maybe picking a pre-existing board might be a more efficient way of doing it than creating a whole new one. And I know there's been a couple of times when I've heard the names of boards mentioned and I've kind of thought like, oh, what about that one? And I stupidly didn't write them down. But I wonder if that isn't a good idea to just go with a pre-existing board that's already going to have meetings, already have things they're doing, and then potentially they could be activated for this special purpose. Because it seemed like the agency wasn't excited to bring on extra responsibilities for them. And I think we don't necessarily want to incur the costs of making it a huge administrative busy thing. So I don't know. I think we'd have to go back and think about who would be those entities. And maybe we could even ask people from the administration, like, what boards do you recommend of the existing farm boards that are out there already?
Yeah, within there's the Working Lands Enterprise
Yeah, that was
Board,
one of them, I think.
which meets, we'd have to have somebody come in and explain
Yeah.
when they meet.
Yeah.
They have a specific role right now, so this would be expanding it. And I'm not sure beyond that, what other boards there are that exist that would be a good fit.
How PGAP did it? It's commerce, but I don't know what the makeup of the team that were applicants was.
Yeah, I think those were grants, but I don't think it was a board that did it. I think it was just an agency that worked on that. Okay, so other thoughts on how we might do this?
I'd ask the agency how they,
I think their testimony was that I'm not sure they were saying it definitively, but I think they were suggesting that, having just the agency do it might make it easier.
yeah.
And who knows that there may not be any kind of extreme weather for the next 10 years, or there might be 5 next year. So
Yeah.
it's hard to
Yeah.
adjust for a board.
They also said that they also wanted us to bear in mind that they have capacity constraints and that taking on more work with their existing staffing might be challenging. I think we want to better understand that. But as you said, we don't know how much more work it would be, in a given year.
I imagine if it's gonna be to the point where, a downburst is considered part of I think there are gonna be applications coming in every year of some sort, if we're doing that. Easily, I mean, like, beyond the mass devastation, but there are wind events
But we're not talking
all the time.
every day or every month necessarily. It could be just several applications a year, unless it's a big event.
Okay.
The agency who administered the organic dairy money when we were experiencing really high prices in feed. And that was more of like an emergency situation too. How was that structured and set up, and could that be similar?
I think that was, we can ask somebody to,
The organic dairy money release, yeah.
I think that was money that was sent out to anybody based on their previous year's revenue, or what the co-ops paid them. So I don't think they needed to demonstrate anything other than they had, that they were selling to a co-op.
Mhm.
So I don't think there was any, like, the board didn't need to sit and review applications and say,
I also think some of that was ARPA funds. You know,
yeah, I think the funding was federal. It helped with that anyway.
Yeah.
But I don't think they needed to call
The
together
agency
people.
themselves didn't have to go through that.
I don't think so, yeah.
Just going back, one question of, on the 50% and connected to the uninsured or otherwise uncovered losses. So if you had crop insurance, but it never covers, what, doesn't even get to 50, right? Well, most of the time.
yeah, sometimes.
But would that be, if half of it wasn't covered by crop insurance, could the other half be eligible for this? Or that NAP we were hearing about, so they call that back because that's
So NAP is,
not covered.
yeah, not an acceptable program, NAP's is a joke,
Yeah,
especially in the vegetable world, in hay, in hay production, it's a little better, but not great. But NAP in the vegetable world's terrible, but if you were insured like through Rain and Hail Insurance Company for your corn crop, you're gonna get, you can sign up for different levels, but you might get, a third or 50 or 2/3.
say you got a third, could you apply for this for the other 2/3?
To bring you up to the halfway point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I was thinking, this came up a couple of years ago when we were doing these, and neonics is, I think there's federal insurance for colony loss, for hives, for the beekeepers here. And so if, say it was 20 below and lost a bunch of hives, then the agency would have to say, are you gonna take the federal insurance for this or not? I mean, it'd be interesting to know. Different farms may have different types of insurance,
Yeah.
whether it's federal or privately,
So I think the way this is written, if you're insured, if you have some of your losses covered by insurance, then that's taken into account, but it doesn't disqualify you from getting something from this fund.
Yeah. Is that actually in here? Because, I mean, I was just looking at it's just four criteria. It has verbiage that says shall include, and that's not one of them.
Which page are you on?
Lines 12 through 15 on page 5. Yeah, maybe it should also have, other sources of insurance.
Yeah.
Because if you're already getting awarded half the amount from. The thing is that you're not gonna get it within 2 weeks, that's for sure. Like FSA is gonna be like
And
9 months later.
you still
That's
have
what it
real
was.
losses,
Mine
too.
was 10 months later, but.
Mm.
But it would be a little, if you got half your crop value awarded and within 2 weeks, and then FSA also awarded you half the crop value, you got the full value of your crop paid for.
Right.
Like, what do you do about those situations?
Yeah.
Because that's not really. Yeah, and then also it's like, is there a requirement for farms to have insurance signed up through FSA that can't qualify? Say, look, you can't just come for this, like you need to already be trying to get crop insurance too. So it's not to avoid.
This becomes their insurance.
Right.
You want to prevent.
I think we're signing up now.
Michelle?
I was just gonna say, on page 4, the first item that's talked about says grants from the fund shall be in an amount that reimburses a farm up to 50% of uninsured or otherwise uncovered losses. So it seems like it's assumed that you might have 50% that is insured. And then what they're allowing is 50% from this fund. So that's number one. It's line 7 on page 4.
Maybe it needs to say 50% of crops that are not insured.
Of uninsured, otherwise uncovered.
It feels a little bit backward, the way that it's stated.
Well, if you are insured, say I have crop insurance on my apples.
Yeah.
Then I won't qualify.
No, then you would have 50% you could get from your insurance and 50% you could get from this.
I almost wonder if it should say for not insured crops. Because if you're insured, you're gonna receive a payment. It's gonna be later. But you will receive a payment if you're insured.
If you, I don't know how it, in the real world, how it worked, but if you lost your total, let's say apples, and if you don't, or if you're not familiar with how it would actually work, that's fine, Greg. But if you lost your total crop and were insured, what we've heard in the past is that even if you're insured, you're not going to get 100% reimbursement.
No, you don't.
So you'll get something.
Well, you can purchase higher levels.
Yeah. So then I guess the question is, do we want to provide some relief funding to somebody who's not 100% insured? This suggests that we do. We're not requiring somebody to be, 0% insured either. There's a question of incentives maybe that comes up into play here, but the way this is written, the way that I read it anyway, is if you have insurance and you get some reimbursement from your insurance company to cover part of your loss, then the fund is still available to you at 50% of whatever wasn't covered. I think that's what this is saying right now. That we cover half of your uninsured.
It kind of needs to read something, it's a little. Yeah. When I'm reading this right now, it's hard to understand what it's actually saying.
Okay.
You can read it probably a couple ways, but one is. It's up to 50%.
Of uninsured, which so you're out of it if your apples are insured.
That may be a question.
Of uninsured or otherwise uncovered losses. Boy, that, I feel like that needs work.
It's a little bit unclear.
Yeah, and that's, we were basing this off the idea that it's like 50% of the value of a crop, right? So if you lose $10,000 worth of corn, then this would cover you, that you would get paid up to $5,000, right? Is that what we were thinking that means?
Say the numbers again, Greg.
So say you lose $10,000 of corn.
Okay.
I was reading this to say that you could be awarded up to $5,000. Right? If it's worth $10,000.
You're
$50,
right?
Is that what this is?
The way I was reading it was, yes, if you have no insurance, that would be true. But if you were insured, if you bought insurance and the insurance company paid you something, then you would subtract that something and then do the 50% calculation.
That needs clarity, I think, because right now you could actually read it to say that you get 50% on crops that are uninsured.
So it penalizes those who have crop
So
insurance.
yes, so if you have insurance, you're not gonna, and you're not eligible.
Okay. So I think what Ledge Council will do is say, tell me what you want, and we will write a clear sentence. And this isn't clear, so we need to fix it, but we'll need to be able to say, first of all, here's what we want, here's our intent. And
The other thing that's gonna be difficult there is rewarding money quickly, like they're not quick.
because insurance payments aren't quick.
They aren't quick.
Okay.
No, but for a corn crop, for insured crops, corn, apples, soybeans, whatnot. You can collect that later on. A lot of times you don't even sell, if you're, like, if it's a corn crop, the way they insure a corn crop, they insure it on bushels. Even if you're chopping it, they insure it on bushels.
Yes.
So, you don't sell that crop until later in the year. So, you know, and whereas we know the vegetable people, the only thing they have is gnat. Which, you know, we heard paid $1,400 to one and $1,800 to the other. You know,
It's like a tenth of a penny.
So,
yeah,
I mean, the thing that's gonna make it difficult to. They're just gonna have to really, in some cases, guesstimate, okay, what somebody will be awarded on, so you get, if it's say it's $10,000 for the apples, okay, because the first thing they do is they realize, okay, there's been a frost event. Well, did you lose 90% of your fruit buds or did you lose 30? And they can't tell that until months out.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and they don't do the final analysis until you have a crop. So you don't know if they're basing, say, well, did you lose 30 or 90? Like that doesn't come back until months later.
Mhm.
So how are they gonna know to say, oh, you were awarded, you're gonna, on $10,000 for the apples, you're gonna get $5,000, or you're gonna get, say, $2,000 worth of insurance money. So we're gonna award you 50% of 8,000, right? Which would be fourth, right?
Did you know,
Hang on a second, Judge. Leland has his hand up and I wanted to.
It was a little different. We call this a special fund. Why is this not considered insurance?
I think it's not, well, I don't know for sure, but there's no guarantee that there'll be a payment if the fund runs out. We're not, if you have a loss, you might get something if there's money in the fund.
And
But we're not telling you how much.
premiums to be paid.
that's the big thing.
Yeah.
Even dairy margin coverage, you have to pay a premium.
yeah. And if you're in crop insurance, you pay a premium.
So no other insurance company is gonna say, hey, you've got insurance.
Right,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just asking, Greg, with your apple crop insurance, did you know the percentage then that you signed up for?
yeah, we're at the 50% level.
But the unknown was. how-
The unknown is how much of
It's
your
the
product
buds.
you actually lost.
Right, yeah,
Because it takes time to
yeah.
see what the fruit set is, and then sometimes you get fruit set and they just drop off. See,
So you knew the high end at 100% loss at 50, you signed
Right.
up for 50, you know what
right,
you.
and that's based on a value that they set at FSA for what an acre of apples is worth,
Mhm.
which is, a lot lower than what I get paid.
Yeah.
for.
We,
So,
we've invited some insurance company testimony. I don't know whether anybody's gotten back to us yet. It probably won't be this week if we haven't heard from them yet. But I wonder, are there growers, farmers who are purchasing 100% coverage of their losses? Is that something that happens?
Maybe Addison County.
it might be, I mean,
I don't,
for a high end. I don't know, we'd have to talk to some vegetable growers.
Okay.
Just have one other question.
Yeah,
The definition of farm,
yes.
page 3, I. Now, say, like there's a dairy farm, I forget, up in Lancaster, New Hampshire. They have fields in Vermont. And let's say those fields get destroyed,
force,
but their farm is, the farm is owned as an entity in New Hampshire.
Okay.
We award that farm, we got fields in Vermont,
This
but
came up,
they're
yeah,
based
right.
out of,
we had this talk on Friday and I thought if it's grown in Vermont, it's Vermont. If it's, doesn't matter if you're, the pumpkin grower in Bradford and half your pumpkins are in New Hampshire, well, you're SOL. But if your pumpkins are in Bradford are they're covered. If you are, there's farmers that have dairy cows over in New York, but they have cropland in the islands.
Same with the hens. Same with the hens.
Yeah.
And gyros.
Drew, you guys let Drew get into the islands? What is wrong with you?
Massive fields across.
Oh, what? God,
Well, we also have situations where there are Vermont farmers, maybe this is one of them, Vermont-based farmers who have land in New Hampshire or New York or Massachusetts.
been there.
Do they qualify under this if the flood event or the weather event is not in Vermont?
If it's outside our borders, it's a hard stop, I think.
I think
That's up to-
the word Vermont needs to be in here. Parcels is a parcel or parcels of land within the border of Vermont, owned, leased, or managed by a person, and that even
Where's
it
that?
doesn't have anything, it doesn't say anything about being Vermont-based. It
Okay,
Page 3, line 1.
says nothing about Vermont.
yeah.
Yeah, it should say,
I think maybe Greg, actually,
Subject to RAPs.
the subject to RAPs might cover that.
Or say under, but maybe put Vermont RAPs, I don't know what our state Vermont, it's not.
land, because, yeah, there are farms.
The word Vermont should be in somewhere.
A parcel of land in Vermont owned, leased or.
Yeah, that
managed.
I think just consistency, whatever we decide.
Yeah.
You know, it just has to be consistent, whether it's like,
You know, Bert Peasley, whose wife served in this body, he farmed both sides of the river. And he stored his potatoes in New Hampshire. Some of them. The old Marshall potato barn.
So if that barn were to collapse under, I mean, potatoes might survive that, but if the barn were destroyed somehow, wouldn't be covered.
Yeah, I think any land or anything that's not on Vermont land does not qualify.
Okay,
and that unlike, say, the local is, you know, has to be grown in physical Vermont, or the company has to be based in Vermont. So that's one of those situations where we're clear, right? It's not the, you know, even a sugar
Well,
maker who
that's
has.
the other thing is if that farmer in Lancaster, I mean, their taxes for mostly go to New Hampshire. Right?
Not on the Vermont side, they paid.
They're paying
They paid
property
Vermont
taxes on that side.
So take it as another way, up in Norton, there's 4 humongous stainless steel silos. And that's a Canadian company that has a big bush in Norton now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, should they be afforded the same protection as you are? They are sugaring in Vermont. They're contributing to the Vermont economy. You know,
Maybe they need to base a business here too. You know,
well,
and say, hey, you need a form, you want to qualify for the benefits that are paid for by everybody in the state, then you need to set up your business here too, you know. They could in theory have a separate business.
a corporate
Any-
presence
Yeah.
within the state.
I mean, just as long as it's consistent, I don't really care.
you know, so.
I can see where we're benefiting entities that you know, that don't exist in our state, a little, we could be helping out to a degree that we're taking funds away from a farm that is completely inside.
I
the state.
understand. So Michelle, down in your neck of the woods, or David, you know, you're down in the corners. Do you have New Hampshire or Massachusetts farms that have gardens in Vermont? And David, you have New York or Massachusetts farms that have land in Vermont in the vegetable or crop world?
I actually don't know of any, but that doesn't mean that there aren't.
You know,
Yeah, we definitely New York dairy farms are growing
mhm.
corn in Vermont. I'm not sure about Massachusetts on the western side of the state. And I don't really know at all about over
Yeah.
on the eastern side, but
And we know that there's corporate timber lots owned by Weyerhaeuser and, you know, Merck and other big companies own vast tracts of timberland in the state. So, you know,
Why don't we,
I err on the side of that, we wanna make sure we're benefiting the entities that live and work here.
So then we'd say they have a Schedule F and Vermont form under taxes.
Or some verbiage in the definition of farm, meaning that it's. Is this not based in and
Based in.
operated in Vermont?
yeah, I think we can ask village council to come up with the language that would,
And make sure it's constitutional.
oh, that will come up, I'm sure, if it's not, yeah.
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
David, one thing I could see happening is where somebody has recurring losses, like 3 out of 5 years, they're coming with a application.
So not recurring within a year, but over a period of years.
Right, do we want to put verbiage in here for, or we leave that up to the agency to say, hey,
Well,
you should stop growing vegetables next to this brook?
well,
Then, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
yeah,
The coldest hollow in Vermont, right?
well,
Yeah,
remember,
your orchard is not in a good place. It gets frost every 30 years.
so remember, it says it, right now in the language, it says pretty much statewide. You know, or disaster. A disaster is declared. You know, and a microburst may not fall into this realm. Just might not because it's a localized event. But, you know, we know the flood of 23, the flood of 24, the second one in 24 that took out from Kirby up to Holland, you know,
In December.
and McCabe Hill became a memory for 10 months or for 5 months. You know, those were declared disasters by the governor. You know, that would alleviate a lot of that, Greg, of what you're talking about. You know, the Intervale floods probably once every year, usually in the spring. And doesn't flood every summer, nor does the Lamoille River flood every summer. Not every, and have it 2 years in a row is odd, and I'm predicting 10 years of electric gold farming.
So I think that the question that Greg's raising is one we should think about a little bit, because I suppose if you are well insured and we're getting money every year from a fund, and every year you had a loss,
Your rates start to go up.
well, you're right. The insurance companies would respond to that should, a fund also respond to that somehow. And maybe it's, you can't just, we aren't able to fund it every year.
Your cap.
Somehow, yeah. So I'm gonna make a note.
Multiple year cap.
Yeah, unless there were statewide declared disasters.
Sorry, one other thing here, I mean, eligible weather condition doesn't really say a
Statewide.
statewide at all, but you get to further and it mentions the secretary may verify the occurrence of an eligible weather condition. But it doesn't say that that's a regional weather event. It doesn't, it leaves it open to interpretation. So I feel like there needs to be more put in on that.
Okay.
If it's regional, then we don't have to worry about, if a whole region gets hit 3 years in a row with, say, hail in Addison County of various sorts, which has happened 2 years in a row for sure in different spots. At least it gets rid of the problem of one particular farmer coming back 3 or 4 out of 5 years with the same thing.
So we want to, I'm not sure that I'm fully capturing what we've got here, and I'm gonna hold off and not try and capture it. But I think that we're all sort of going in the direction of there should be some limit. We wouldn't want to have somebody coming back year after year, but maybe that's more if it's an isolated case, if it's a statewide or a countywide or half the state is being impacted, then there might be situations where you get 3 bad years in a row and we're going to do what we can to help them. If it's 10 years in a row, at what point do you say this,
Yeah, I guess it's debating whether or not it's really allowing for localized events to be eligible or not right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you think it should.
I think it needs to, I don't know, I'm on either side of the coin. I could see the value of allowing a microburst to qualify. But then you definitely have to have verbiage that says like, how many consecutive years they can.
Well, so a microburst is something that hits the same spot.
Yeah, microburst.
But, drought, if you try to grow vegetables on top of a sand pit and don't plan on irrigating it, you could have drought every year. And if you guarantee 50% of your crop losses,
Really, honestly, frost is probably one of the best examples, because if you grow vegetables or any sort of produce in a pocket that consistently gets frost.
yeah, don't try to grow 110-day corn.
Right, exactly. So that's gonna be
Yours 90
where
days.
things get sticky if we're allowing for localized.
And there's not the checks and balance of insurance premiums, like those go up as your claims go up, to balance that out. This is just like, here's money with no, unless we put a cap in or some other sort of dampening thing.
Or we just make it regional.
Right, yeah.
It has to be several growers over an area that are experiencing the same problem, or else it doesn't trigger.
Michelle.
So I was just thinking, along the lines of sort of poor judgment on the behalf of a farmer. So let's say that somebody's like, hey, I heard it's going to be a warm spring, and they plant a whole bunch of stuff in March, and then it's really warm, and then in April there's a giant frost and everything gets killed. Well, they shouldn't have planted stuff in March. It was bad judgment. They were taking a gamble and they lost. At what point is good judgment or bad luck? I don't know. I wonder if we should measure that a little bit, because there are times where you can plant stuff in April and you're great. And then there are other times you plant in April and you're going to lose everything. And we don't want to drain the fund because somebody's.
Well, if that's perhaps an extreme illustration, but there may be cases where people are trying to plant a little bit earlier to get a longer growing season in.
Yeah.
I don't feel I can speak to that. We can ask the farmers when they're in, to weigh in on that. We could ask this farmer, I guess, also to weigh in on that.
There might be some number that would make sense.
So along with required agricultural practices, we put in acceptable agricultural practices. And it's acceptable down in Westminster.
Yeah.
Is way different than it is in Derby.
Yeah.
Wait, are you proposing that we have something called acceptable practices?
We put those in with the required, because, example, I planted my lettuce Friday. Now, I didn't plant a whole raised bed. I did a small section with 2 rows of radish. And if they come up, great, I'm ahead of the game. I got them tended the whole 9 yards. Great. And if the 20th of May, there's no life, you just erase the dirt and do it again. But I'm trying to get ahead of the ball, like you said.
But you're not going to plant an acre like that.
Yeah.
You plant an acre like that and you're like, oh, so sad. I lost my
Yeah, I
crop.
got a claim.
Yeah.
And that could, without making it a regional thing, that could be a very common occurrence
Yeah.
that they have to deal with.
Oh, we push the envelope planting corn every year. And if we get kissed by frost, well, damn, and we replant it. The seed is guaranteed to us from our grower because it's treated with neonicotinoids and they guarantee your seed. But,
But I think
Read the farmer's almanac.
we're also getting into, this is extreme weather, so anything that just sort of happens normally seasonally.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not going to qualify anyway.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right, John.
Yeah, so
Wait.
frost in May, May 20th is going to be different than frost in, April.
Exactly.
Where I live, that's fairly common.
In Westminster.
Just realizing that we've been going for a while, and I would say rather than take a break and come back, since we're nearing the end, maybe we can just go through the end of we're on page 7. Where we're talking about the makeup of the board. And recognizing that there's an open question about whether a board is the way we want to go, or whether it's a new board or somehow an existing board. This is talking about the membership and what the terms of the board members would be. Anybody feel strongly that what's drafted here is not the way to go? We can review that.
I would definitely strike out that they had to have had been in a disaster. I'd strike that out because chances are if they've been in one, and if this is a big event, they're going to be in the midst of that one too. And then it raises your ability to function on that board.
We could also, somebody suggested somewhere along the way that we could have alternate members who could fill in if somebody had their own disaster, or if they wanted to recuse themselves because they had their own disaster. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Members serve initial terms of 2 years, thereafter 3 years. A vacancy should be filled by the appointing authority. Shall serve no more than 3 consecutive terms. And then the powers of the board. The review board shall review applications, assess the accuracy, and recommend to the secretary who should receive assistance. The board shall annually report to us in order to ensure the fund is meeting the needs. The board shall annually review the application process, eligibility criteria, et cetera. So the way that this is written, we're building in a mechanism for the board in the future to come back and say, you did a lot of good work. Here's something that we've noticed that we might want to improve. Because even though you thought about this long and hard, you know, we noticed this.
So the board is the way we would like to go as opposed to.
I don't mean to suggest that at all, but just this is what it currently says. If we had a board, this is the way, the board would be, what the makeup would be, and some of the things that they would be asked to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Is
ahead.
there a fiscal note to the board, or are they all voluntary? Except for the department people that are, it's just part of
Yeah,
theirs.
I think that the very last section here on this page gets to that. So hold on. Richard?
Yeah, and Chairman, are these rules or will these be a statute? Because statute's harder to change, where if they're rules, they can be, it's something I learned. Rules, we can change them easily.
Yeah, so this is statute, what we're looking at. And as to whether rules are easier to change or not, I'm not sure that I would I'm sure that I can comment on that. I'm not certain that that's always true, but I can ask Ledge Council.
Okay.
But what we could do is we can always give a board the authority to write its own rules or come up with its own practices. We're sort of stepping back and saying, you guys figure out some of the details that we didn't feel comfortable writing into statute.
Yeah, but then they should come back and get an okay. Whether it's just a rubber stamp, report back to us on what they.
So then getting on to Jed's question, before we get there are the provision for officers. If the board wants to, they may elect officers. So this is a may rather than a shall. They may establish subcommittees. They may adopt procedural rules. So Richard, to your point, such as it shall determine necessary and appropriate. Quorums. So you need a quorum, you need a majority to get a quorum. Action taken by the board may be authorized by a majority present. The board may meet as an advisory body under that chapter 5 of one VSA. And I think maybe we should have Ledge Council just tell us exactly what that is. And then finally, compensation. Private members shall be entitled to per diem compensation. Yes,
And I'm reading that.
that is, and we can also have them tell us what that is. I think it's a fairly modest amount.
So I think it's like $70 a day or something like that, and mileage.
And then the effective date. So
Then people that already would be covered, like if their salary already is related to this, like they were serving on behalf of an organization, then they wouldn't get it. So it would just be private people.
yes,
Do you know, like either Richard's seasonal suggestion or Greg's quarterly, are there funds that work that way where essentially appropriated money July 1st is sort of just banked until, it's released at a certain date during that fiscal year? Or covers 2 fiscal years? It's an interesting idea. I've just never heard of that.
right, yeah. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. We have the capital bill, which is 2 years that we just
Right, yeah.
looked at, but that's slightly different situation.
So how much is the fund going to be? And how are we going to source it?
Yes, so the two,
$1 million
yes,
question.
yeah, we didn't, there is no money in the House passed version of the budget. And the Senate now has that budget, and I don't know, I haven't heard any update, but I know when the Senate first looked at this bill, the Ag Committee, they had asked for 7.5 million. So to be determined, I think, and the Senate will pass a budget and then it will be reconciled. As to how it will be paid for, I don't think that the Senate, I don't know, but I don't think that I've heard anything that the Senate is planning to have any new revenue. So it would just come out of the general fund.
So it would come out,
I think it would come
not
out
with a new revenue.
with existing revenue somehow. So they would be taking something that we have passed and said, instead of doing that, we're going to put the money towards this program. And I don't even want to speak for that other body because they may not be doing that at all. So they're purely speculating.
Thank you. I was at a Ledge breakfast Monday in Jeffersonville, and all, including Higley, who's from Lowell, but he represents Eden, part of Lamoille County. Virtually all the other, not if one wasn't there, but Senator Westman was there, and there's a lot of discussion, healthcare and the hospital. And every advocacy imaginable. I talked a little about our food bank, Vermonters Feeding Vermont, all that stuff. But I think we should note that Senator Westman said at this meeting, there's something like $67 million of fund requests.
Possible to sit in or?
Yes.
Of fund requests above, what the governor's budget was for. And there are a lot of, he talked about transportation where normally we would pay between 450 miles typical year. Last year, it was down to about, this year maybe 250, but they may only have enough money to do 170 miles. So he said, as far as all these requests, my guess is everything's beyond tight. So all these above that base budget expect very little. if any.
Yeah, so that's a better answer than I was, more informed
Well,
answer
it
than I was
just-
able to provide.
It's anecdotal and it's a semi-direct quote, but that gives you the flavor of someone talking to advocates in a broad county.
I certainly like Michelle's idea. Maybe we should explore our own ways of coming up with someone.
Chairman, I also, though, I look at this as a vehicle once set in place. That if there is, a disaster declared and there's FEMA money coming in. Or if, like Ag has now released the $20 million or what, or is it more than that, to be divided up by 7 states.
Right.
This is, that's a place for this money could go into to go back out of. And that's part of the reason for setting this up. We may get it funded this year, we may not, but if we set it up, now it's there waiting. And if we have, revenues, we have another eclipse and a great ski season and a wonderful summer tourist season. And milk prices go up and farmers make money and pay taxes for the first time in 50 years. Yeah, and we have money, the BAA is bigger and, we could say, hey, we can take some money from here and slide it in to fund this.
Yeah, or even private donations, because
Yeah,
that's,
exactly.
yeah, there's the provision for that.
Will you also come to the farm aid tour?
Well, I think
It's pretty old.
rather than get in, so I know, Michelle, you had mentioned we should talk about revenue the other day. So sounds like there's an appetite for at least having some conversation there.
I
And,
have a tiny follow-up about that, but I don't know if you want it now or not.
okay, sure.
So I talked to the member that you recommended I talk to, and she said there were a lot of people who were thinking about how they could raise revenue.
Yeah.
And like maybe the healthcare committee, and I actually heard that somebody from the healthcare committee has an idea about a sugary drink that they were going to introduce next year. But this person from Ways and Means said if we were going to propose that as a way of funding the farm bill or the farmers' needs, because those are a legitimate need too, she thought it might be more palatable if it were partly funding the farm issue, but also having some overflow that would help to alleviate other stresses in the budget too. Because like the proposal that I got from the American Heart Association from the study was that we could raise $30 million if we raised, I think it was 1 cent on every ounce or something like that. And, the Senate was going to make it 7.5 million. The original ask was 20 million for this fund, but there could be a pretty good chunk left over that could go to some other cost. But she also said, she actually suggested that our chair talk to the Ways and Means chair because she said it was kind of above our pay grade. So I told her we were doing research and I would pass on.
Well, I appreciate your having that conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that historically, I'll just say historically, any increase in revenue is a heavy lift, no matter who is sitting in our chairs in all of these rooms. But I think that, recognizing that if this is an important priority, that it may be something that we want to continue having conversations about. We're not sure what the revenue source would be. Let's not shut it down entirely just
I think
because of that.
it feels like if we don't come up with a revenue source, we're going to come up with such a small amount of money, if any, that it's not going to be very helpful.
But yeah, that's a good point. John, did you have any numbers?
Just two follows up on that. One, I mean, my idea was a tax on groceries, which is anathema, but good tax policy is the broader the base. It can be an incredibly small tax to raise a lot of money. But interesting, on Friday, one of the farmers even said, hey, in a good year, even farmers would potentially, kick into this fund so that in bad years, they cover themselves. I mean, there's that sort of spirit in the community.
Insurance premium.
No.
I'll just say to the sugary tax thing,
Mhm.
which I consume my share of sugary drinks a lot less than I used to, way lot less. And it's a sin tax and I'm all about it. But I'd use that money to feed people. I'd use that money to feed people. You know, and this could be part of it. It's the security, but then also the farm to school and the Vermonters feeding Vermonters and whatnot. And I was like,
Many,
yeah, there's a lot of places that syntax could go to making better.
I'm gonna talk to Mike O'Grady. We do have testimony scheduled at the end of the week from the Farm Bureau. I think NOFA is going to want to come back in and testify, and we'll have been able to process some of our conversation today. Yeah, I also reached out to the agency and asked them if they had, more specific suggestions. So we'll be getting more input. The insurance, I think it would be really helpful to just hear from an insurance person. So we'll try to line that up. And I've got notes here on the conversations we had. There's still some policy things I think we would need to hammer out, but I think it's been a really useful conversation to dig into it a little bit. So thank you for the time.
Well, we haven't even touched into forestry.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And we won't forget that, but
That discussion maybe.
yeah. Yes, we also have, right, we do have testimony on Friday, but yeah. Great.
What's the possibility of maybe taking just a tiny chunk of current use taxes? Have a sliver of it go into, that's fine.
I think.
So that, the taxes that farmers are essentially paying in are going to help insure them too.
I
That
am not.
probably doesn't move politically,
Yeah,
but
so are you thinking
it's
of,
a small, like you say, it's like 1 or 2 million a year.
yeah, so are you thinking of the land use penalty, that when you withdraw, or are you thinking of
Or the
the
current use itself.
Current use
property tax?
property tax, if we put a 10 cent per acre fee on everything enrolled. I don't remember the number of acres enrolled, it's quite big. Or,
It all goes to the ed fund.
Well, bear in mind that, so the property tax, the state part of it goes to the ed fund. And then the current use is essentially it's a smaller amount of what you would be paying otherwise, so.
$575 an acre to me, I think.
So we would be diverting some of that money from the ed fund. It's currently going to the ed fund, so we'd be diverting it from the ed fund to another program, which would have the overall impact of putting upward pressure on property tax. So that when you reacted the way you did, John, in the current climate, anything that raises property taxes.
Or downward pressure on the ed fund.
Yeah, that isn't gonna happen. They'd like to come after our current use pretty hard.
That, what you were saying about Senator Westman, like, there's a move to raise the general fund to make the ed fund, look better.
Right, I'm going back in history 2.25 years when, Stonyfield or Horizon, who was the Western New York organic?
Horizon left.
Horizon left, and all of a sudden, the year started with 180 some organic certified dairy farms that dropped down to under 130, and every week there was another farm dropping out. And there was testimony here that you had to really almost get out of your chair to hide your emotions. It was so painful. So we stood up a bill that eventually passed. Number got reduced, but not a lot. So maybe started at 9 or so million, it went down to 6.7 or so. And that was dispersed for a lot of
More
people.
money in those days.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that that wouldn't have gotten consideration if it was this year. In my limited experience, it just wouldn't have been a possibility. That's how dire I think our current.
Despite the very compelling
Right, and it was, you remember that was from John. That was really.
But thanks, everybody, for a long conversation, good conversation. Well, we're gonna be back in, are we here at 9 tomorrow morning, Sonia?
Mhm.
So that's an upgrade or a change. It was 9:30, but it's gonna be 9.
Nine.
Tomorrow. Yeah, and we're taking some testimony on the rodenticide bill tomorrow.
26.
Okay, we can go offline.
When were these, Ed?